Greetings, listeners and viewers. I'm here today with Dr. Anna Yusim. Dr. Anna Yusim is an internationally recognized, award-winning, board-certified, Stanford and Yale-educated psychiatrist and executive coach with a private practice in New York City, Connecticut, California, and Florida. With clients including Forbes 500 CEOs, Olympic athletes, A-list actors and actresses, and the chairs of academic departments at top universities, Dr. Anna Yusim helps influential people achieve greater impact, purpose, and joy in their life and work. Dr. Yusim is the best-selling author of Fulfilled: How the Science of Spirituality Can Help You Live a Happier, More Meaningful Life. As a clinical assistant professor at Yale Medical School, Dr. Yusim is presently working to create a mental health and spirituality program center at Yale with Dr. Christopher Pittenger, who will be a bridge between the Yale Medical School and Yale Divinity School. And there's so much more on her bio, but we're going to get into that in our story. So welcome, Dr. Yusim. So nice to see you.
Thank you so much, Bob. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
A pleasure. And I know that our listeners and viewers are going to be very interested to find out about your backstory, because the part of the bio that I just read describes kind of where you are now. But in our first of 3 podcasts, we're going to examine your backstory, what led you to all of this. So take us through a little trip down memory lane, if you would, Dr. Yusim.
Amazing, Bob. Thank you. So had anyone told me I would become excuse me, I have a little bit of a cough today. Had anyone told me I'd be a spiritual person 25 years ago, I would have laughed. Spirituality was furthest from my mind. I was born in Russia and came to America, to Chicago, with my family when I was 5 years old. My father, a biomedical engineer by training, not very spiritual, but my family was Jewish. And so for him, our Judaism and spirituality was tied to our culture, to the history, to what his parents and himself and our family had gone through as Jews. So really the triumph and the struggle of the Jewish people. My mother, in contrast, was a very spiritual person. She was always looking for examples of faith and spirituality, even outside the Jewish religion. And when I was young, would read things about Hare Krishna, about Buddhism, and things like that. And so in coming to America, my parents had much more freedom of religious expression. And my mother took advantage of that. We would do much more things with our own religion. With Judaism, we'd light Shabbat candles, we'd go to temple. But growing up, I was a lot more like my dad, very rational, not very spiritual, just wasn't an important part of my life or of my mind. And it wasn't until the end of my residency training that spirituality actually came into my life. I was experiencing a dark night of the soul. I'd broken up with a man with who I was in a 5-year relationship. I was not feeling very connected to my psychiatry residency program. All of that together was leading me to question my life and not feel very good. And for whatever reason, during that time, rather than I think I did try actually to turn to my own profession. And I think I was in therapy for a while and tried that, but it wasn't helping. So rather than turning to all the things I knew, I turned to something I'd never turned to before, and that was faith. And so I started going to lectures at my synagogue and other lectures to try to give me a sense of purpose and meaning and help me better understand what I was going through. And I was trying to figure out, how do I lead a happier, more meaningful life? Because, even though I was going through some hardship, my life was actually pretty great. I was living in New York City. I was at NYU for my residency. I loved psychiatry, even though I didn't love my residency program. I was healthy, had tons of friends. Yes, I just broken up with this guy, but there were so many other guys out there. There was, life was actually good. But, somehow or another, it was still the dark night of the soul period for me. And so that's when the universe started showing me things that I had never experienced before. For instance, I had just gone to a lecture at one of the temples and was coming back and felt compelled to go have some ice cream in this ice cream store. And I sat down in the ice cream store, and this psychic with a young child comes up to me and says, "I'm a psychic. I have a message for you. Can I give you a message?" She looked rather innocuous. I said, sure, give me your message. And so she sits down and proceeds to tell me all of these deep truths about my life that she had no way of knowing, that, excuse me, that actually nobody had any way of knowing. It wasn't written in my journal. It wasn't written on Facebook, certainly. And so this woman had somehow channeled something from, including the name of the guy at the time that I had a crush on. So she just channeled like all of these random things. And that to me was such a eye-opening experience because it started to lead me to see the world in a slightly different way. I'd been taught in medical school that we see the world, my mind is separate from your mind. There's no way you can possibly read my mind of all things. And here was somebody doing just that, or she was reading something, that was very deep and personal that I didn't think people had access to. And so that led me to really question, how does the mind really work? And how does the world really work? And that was the beginning of my spiritual path.
So the story kind of describes a little bit of this your position as being sort of between your mother and your father's background, leaving from Russia, which I'm assuming was a place where you didn't talk about this much, but I'm reading between the lines, a place where you could not express yourself religiously because of how that goes against the materialism that's inherent in Marxism. So an environment where you couldn't really explore your spirituality, where you found yourself in a much more rational position. You moved to the United States, which is, they say, a land of religious freedom, where you can explore that. What about the connection between your background in academically in psychiatry, which tends toward materialism, and this spiritual awakening? Did you have any kind of conflict going on inside of you at that time?
Absolutely. Like the way that I see the world now is so different than the way that I was trained in several different facets. Number one, this idea of the soul, right? What is the soul? So in all of my training to become a doctor and ultimately a psychiatrist at Stanford, Yale, and NYU, the word soul was never really mentioned. But one of the translations of psychiatry, right? The prefix of psychiatry is possibly the soul. So I'm a doctor of the soul. Another, there's another definition is mind. So you can say I'm a doctor of the mind, but one definite definition is a doctor of the soul. And yet we're not really taught about what this soul is. And so I was very curious about that as well. And that took me on my own around the world journey, going to ashrams in India, going to learn Buddhist meditation in Thailand, going to study with different shamans in South Africa and South America, and ultimately, and also learning Kabbalah in Israel, ultimately coming back to America in order to study more Kabbalah here and trying to integrate all of this. And so my favorite definition of the soul was given to me by a Mexican shaman named Fernando Broca. And he said that the soul is comprised of two parts. One part is that which is our uniqueness in this world. So the way that I'm different from everybody else and the unique contribution that I can make based on my interest experience is basically my soul. And the second part is the part that is interconnected with everybody and everything, that we are all one. And that, they often say we're one unified soul, but I never knew what that meant. And it was with Fernando Broca that I started understanding that. So that's one way in which the super rational psychiatric training was different than what I was learning. And the other way is throughout history, some of the greatest psychiatrists were actually atheistic, anti-religious, did not have faith, Sigmund Freud being a prime example. And they saw faith or religion as being a universal obsessional neuroses. That was Sigmund Freud's words, essentially a crutch that you hold on to if you're weak and if you're not able to deal with the world as it is. So it's like you need something outside of the world to grasp onto as a way of dealing with your own vulnerability as a human. And so within the profession, there was that. So the very fact that now at Yale, they're open to us creating a mental health and spirituality program and center is just an eye-opening, beautiful thing. And that there's other institutions like Harvard that have similar programs It's really, really beautiful. And I think a big part of that also is the psychedelic movement, because psychedelics is a way of people connecting to spirituality through these very powerful plant and other medicines.
So let's go back to this curious interaction that you had with Fernando Broca
Mm-hmm.
and his description of the soul. Because perhaps there's no better example of this dissonance than to look at conventional psychiatry with, if it is materialist in nature, it's the idea that there is no soul, there is mind that we can talk about, but certainly nothing permanent like a soul, versus this two-part soul that you just described. The uniqueness of a person in the world, and the second part being the interconnected oneness with everything. So how did you accommodate that into the model of how you work with people? And we're going to get into that part later, but I'm just talking about the initial dissonance between those two views.
Yeah. I think whenever one encounters dissonant views, whenever I encounter dissonant views, which is, by the way, all the time, I always hold them together, right? You hold them together and you observe, and you are trying on some level to figure it out, but also just holding both truths as possibilities. And as you hold both truths as possibilities, you see what evidence bubbles up in your life, in the world, in your mind, to give credence to one truth versus the other. And, this holding multiple truths, this is something that I'm always doing also with my patients, right? Because with patients as a psychiatrist, I'm constantly evaluating and reevaluating together with them the narratives that they have about their own life. And we're figuring out which narratives are more constructive, which ones are more destructive, which narratives is it time to release because it's no longer serving them. And how do we hold multiple truths? And then which truth do we choose to align with? Or do we choose to hold multiple truths and be open to the both possibilities and live the mystery, which is another way.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
So getting back to your training, how did you fit all of these journeys that you described to me? So you talked about going to ashrams in India, working in Buddhism, shamanism in Latin America, and Kabbalah. How did that fit into your professional work in terms of the time? So you set up this, I assume, independent practice at some point along the way, and then you went on these global journeys.
Yes. So the global journeys preceded my practice. The global journeys were actually in large part during my residency when I was doing much of this questioning. So right before that. And it was towards the end of my residency that I started questioning and then went on these journeys to answer my questions or attempt to answer my questions. I don't know if my questions are fully answered even now. And so, and then after I completed my residency training, I hung up my shingle and started my practice. And then I didn't travel for a while because then that was my commitment. Maybe I would go on a trip here and there, but it's much harder when you have a very busy practice to leave your patients. And I continue to have a very busy practice, and it continues to be difficult to leave my patients.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Yusim, we have so much to talk about. I think I could spend an entire day in an interview with you, but this is going to bring us to the close of part one. And the teaser for what's coming up is we'll explore a little bit more about your book, about the work that you're doing, and some possible takeaways for our listeners and our viewers to use in their lives. So let me just give you a moment to let everybody know, how can people get in touch with you?
Absolutely, Bob. Thank you so much. And you can reach me on my website, which is www.annayusim, my full name.com, ANNAYUSIM as in Mary.
Wonderful. So www.annayusim.com. And let me say a big hearty thank you for being here for part one of our podcast interview.
Thank you so much, Bob.
And thank you, everyone, for listening.